road of silver. Even before the discovery of the Americas, trading patterns had begun to pick up after the economic shocks of the 15th century. Some scholars argue that this was caused by improved access to gold markets in West Africa, combined with rising output in mines in the Balkans and elsewhere in Europe, perhaps made possible by technological advances that helped unlock new supplies of previous metals. It seemed, for example, that silver production rose fivefold in the decades after 1460 in Saxony, Bohemia, and Hungary, as well as in Sweden. Other scholars point to the fact that tax collection became more efficient in the second half of the 15th century. Economic contraction had forced lessons to be learned, not the least of which was the need to control the tax base more vigilantly, something that in turn led to what has been called the revival of monarchy, where centralization was as important from a monetary point of view as it was socially and politically. To judge from the account of a Korean traveler, the velocity of trade seems to have increased in the late 15th century. In the port of Suzhou, around 70 miles from Shanghai, ships were gathering like clouds, wrote Zhou Pu, waiting to take their shipments of thin silks, gauzes, gold, silver, jewels, crafts to new markets. The city was filled with rich merchants and boasted impressive standards of living. The people live luxuriously, he wrote enviously, noting that market quarters are scattered like stars in this rich and fertile region. Although this was promising, the key lay not in the harbors of the Chinese Pacific coast, but thousands of miles away in the Iberian Peninsula. The solution came in two parts. Europe's gradual economic upturn in the latter part of the 15th century had already stimulated consumer demand for luxury products. An immense reservoir of resources built up as the riches of the New World were shipped to Spain. In Seville, gold and silver were stored like wheat in the customs house, prompting the construction of a new building that could receive the astonishing volume of incoming goods so that they could be taxed correctly. One observer wrote of his amazement as the hull of one fleet was unloaded. On one day alone, he saw 332 cartloads of silver, gold, and precious pearls being brought to be formally accounted for. 6 weeks later, he saw another 686 loads of precious metal being brought in. There was so much, he wrote, that the Casa de Contraction could not accommodate it all and overflowed into the patio. The huge windfall that came with Columbus's crossing of the Atlantic coincided with the spectacular success of another maritime expedition that was no less ambitious. Just as fears began to grow in Spain that Columbus's attempt to find a route to Asia had been an expensive mistake, another fleet was equipped and made ready to sail. Placed under the command of Vasco da Gama, the crews were received by the King of Portugal, Manuel I, before they left. Pointedly neglecting to mention the recent discoveries across the Atlantic, the sovereign outlined da Gama's objective, to find a new way into India and the countries lying near to it. In doing so, he went on the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, which would be proclaimed as new kingdoms and realms were seized from the infidels, that is, the Muslims. But he had an eye on more immediate rewards too. Would it not be wonderful, he mused, to acquire the riches of the East that are so celebrated by the ancient authors? Just look, he continued, at how Venice, Genoa, and Florence, and the other great Italian cities had benefited from trade with the East. The Portuguese were painfully aware that they lay not just on the wrong side of the world, but even at the wrong end of Europe. That all changed with da Gama's speculative expedition. Things did not look promising when his ships first reached southern Africa. The disappointment was less with the inhabitants, who dressed in skins and wore sheaths over their genitals, or with the food, the meat from seals and gazelles and the roots of herbs for chewing. It was that when samples of cinnamon, cloves, pearls, gold, and many other things were shown to the locals, it was clear that they had no knowledge of them whatsoever. As he rounded the Cape of Good Hope and headed north, Da Gama's luck changed. At Malindi, he not only learnt of the passage east, but found an experienced pilot willing to help him deal with the monsoon winds and reached India. After a journey lasting 10 months, he anchored off the port of Calicut. He had succeeded where Columbus had failed. He had found a sea route to Asia. There were already communities of traders from close to home. Among the first voices he heard were those speaking in a familiar tongue. "The devil take you," shouted one of the two Muslim merchants from Tunis, who could speak Spanish and Genoese. "What brought you here?" After exchanging pleasantries, what they said next was music to his ears. "What good fortune you have! What good fortune! There are so many rubies here, so many emeralds. You should give great thanks to God for bringing you to a land where there are such riches." Nevertheless, the Portuguese struggled to make sense of what they saw, just as Columbus had done. Temples filled with statues of Hindu gods wearing crowns were thought to be churches adorned with images of Christian saints, while water thrown and purification rituals was interpreted as holy water being dispensed by Christian priests. Stories of how St. Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples apparently, had reached India and converted large numbers to Christianity had long circulated in Europe, prompting no end of erroneous conclusions to be drawn and brought back by Da Gama, not least that there were large numbers of Christian kingdoms in the East ready to fight against Islam. Much of what was reported about what had been seen in the East turned out to be misleading or, in fact, plain wrong. Negotiations with the Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, further tested Da Gama, who was forced to explain why, if the kingdom of Portugal truly possessed incredible wealth, far in excess of any king of these parts, as the admiral had told him, he could offer no evidence of these riches. Indeed, when he produced a selection of hats and wash basins along with some strings of coral, sugar, and honey, the Zamorin's courtiers laughed out loud. Not even the poorest merchant from Mecca would insult their ruler with such a pitiful selection of gifts, they said. Tension mounted. The Portuguese found their movements restricted as they were kept under the watchful eye of a large contingent of guards, all armed with swords, two-edged battle axes, shields, and bows and arrows. Vasco da Gama and his men feared the worst until, without warning, the Zamorin announced that he would allow the Portuguese to land their goods and to trade after all. They eagerly stocked up on spices and merchandise to show what they had found on their travels and set off home. What they brought back home changed the world. Da Gama's return after 2 years of epic travel led to rapturous celebration. In a ceremony in Lisbon Cathedral to mark his successes, Vasco was openly likened to Alexander the Great, a comparison that was eagerly adopted and repeatedly used by contemporary writers, and not just in Portugal, to describe the achievement of opening up a new and unfamiliar world in the East. That he had reached India was a major propaganda triumph for King Manuel, who immediately wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, his parents-in-law, trumpeting the achievement, writing with undisguised delight about how his men had brought cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, and pepper, together with other spices and flora, as well as many fine stones of all sorts, such as rubies. Doubtless, he added gleefully, "Your Highness will hear of these things with much pleasure and satisfaction." Columbus spoke of potential. Da Gama had delivered results. The results of Spain received some consolation. After the first expedition across the Atlantic, Ferdinand and Isabella had lobbied the Pope to grant to Spain sovereignty of all territories discovered across the Atlantic, in the same way that the papacy had done repeatedly in the course of the 15th century in relation to Portuguese expeditions in Africa. No fewer than four papal bulls were issued in 1493, setting out how new discoveries should be treated. After much bickering over precisely where to draw a longitudinal line, terms were eventually reached in 1494 with the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas, which established a boundary 370 leagues beyond the Cape Verde Islands. A straight line should be drawn, the treaty stated, north and south, from pole to pole on the said sea ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Everything to the west should belong to Spain, and everything to the east to Portugal. 30 years later, the full significance of the agreement was becoming clear. By 1520, Portuguese ships had explored even further east, traveling beyond India to reach Malacca, the Spice Islands, and Guangzhou. The Spanish, meanwhile, not only realized that they had discovered two continents in the Americas, but with the astonishing expedition of a sailor who managed to cross the Pacific and reach the Philippines and the Spice Islands, they had achieved an unprecedented circumnavigation of the globe. There was some irony in the fact that the man who led this mission was Portuguese and had taken service from a Spain that was willing to fund efforts to reach the Spice Islands from the west and secure them not for his country of birth but for its neighbor and rival. When Fernão de Magalhães, better known as Ferdinand Magellan, embarked on this epic expedition in 1519 to 1520, Portugal and Spain went back to the negotiating table to agree a line in the Pacific to match the one that had been drawn in the Atlantic. The two Iberian neighbors divided the globe between them, and they had the blessing of the papacy, and therefore of God. The rest of Europe had now to adjust to the rising fortunes of Spain and Portugal. News of Vasco da Gama's return home in 1499 was received with a mixture of shock, gloom, and hysteria in Venice. One loud voice told all who would listen that the discovery of a sea route to India via southern Africa meant nothing less than the end for the city. It was inevitable, said Girolamo, that Lisbon would take Venice's crown as the commercial center of Europe. There is no doubt, he wrote, that the Hungarians, the Germans, the Flemish, and the French, and all the people from across the mountains who used to come to Venice to buy spices with their money will now turn to Lisbon. For Priuli, the reasons were obvious. Everyone knew, he stated in his diary, that goods reaching Venice over land went through endless checkpoints where taxes and duties had to be paid. By transporting goods by sea, the Portuguese would be able to offer good prices Venice could not hope to compete with. The number told the story. Venice was doomed. Others reached similar conclusions. Guido Detti, a Florentine merchant based in Portugal in the early 1500s, was adamant that the Venetians would lose control of commercial traffic because they would not be able to match the prices of goods brought by sea to Lisbon. The people of Venice, he observed wryly, would have to go back to being fishermen. The city would fall back into the lagoons from which it had risen. Rumors of the demise of Venice were misplaced, at least in the short term, as a more sober voice stressed. The opening up of a sea route to the east was not without risks. Many Portuguese vessels never made it home. Less than half of the 114 ships that passed the southern tip of Africa had returned safely. The Venetian statesman Vincenzo Corini told the Senate in 1506, 19 are lost for sure, almost all of them laden with spices, and of another 40, nothing is known. Nevertheless, envoys were soon sent by Venice to Muslim Egypt to discover ways of cooperating against the Portuguese, with suggestions of joint military operations and even anticipating the construction of the Suez Canal centuries later, contemplating whether a waterway should or could be dug through to the Red Sea to allow passage to as many ships and galleys as one wanted. Although the Portuguese were convinced that operations directed against them in the Red Sea and off the coast of Indian territory in the early 16th century were the result of a grand alliance orchestrated against them by Venice, but in truth the Egyptians needed little encouragement to try to impose control over their own shipping lanes. The appearance of rising numbers of Portuguese ships had been unwelcome, not least because the new arrivals were highly aggressive. On one occasion, Vasco da Gama himself captured a ship filled with hundreds of Muslims returning to India after going on pilgrimage to Mecca. Ignoring the desperately generous offer on those aboard to pay a ransom, he ordered the ship to be set on fire in an act so grotesque that one observer aloud, "I will remember what happened every single day of my life." Women held up their jewelry to beg for mercy from the flames or from the water, while others held up their infants to try to protect them. Vasco da Gama watched impassively, cruelly and without any pity, as every last passenger and crew member drowned before his eyes. Attacks on ports and strategically sensitive locations were a worrying development for Egypt. Jeddah, the port of Mecca, was attacked in 1505, while soon afterwards Muscat and Qualhat, key points in the Persian Gulf, were sacked and their mosques burnt to the ground as well, including the port of Mecca, Jeddah. Worrying too was the fact that the Portuguese began to think in terms of establishing a network of bases in a chain connecting back to Lisbon. There could be nothing more important, argued the commander and explorer Francisco de Almeida in 1505, than to have a castle at the mouth of the Red Sea, or very near to it, since this would mean that all of those in India would rid themselves of the foolish idea that they might trade with anyone other than ourselves. In the face of such violence and posturing, squadrons were dispatched at the command of the Sultan in Cairo, with orders to patrol the Red Sea and its approaches, and, where appropriate, to engage in direct action. Some Portuguese commanders concluded that a change in tactics was necessary. Their ships were being needlessly exposed to danger. One told the King of Portugal it would be better to abandon forts that had been built in provocative locations, such as on the island of Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea, and instead to foster cordial relations with Muslim Egypt. The initial burst of Portuguese exploration had been accompanied with swaggering violence and brutal intolerance. It did not take long, however, for things to settle down and for the initial swashbuckling rhetoric about the triumph of Christianity and the demise of Islam to give way to a more sanguine and realistic approach. With commercial opportunities aplenty, attitudes to Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism quickly softened, just as they had done in the Crusader states, as bluster was replaced by acknowledgement that a heavily outnumbered minority needed to establish a working relationship to ensure its survival. This cut both ways for rival rulers in India and in places like Macau and the Malay Peninsula, which were more than willing to compete with each other by giving better trading terms to the European merchants to make sure that additional inflows of money would go to them and not to their rivals. In this context, it was in everyone's interests to play down differences of faith as far as possible. Nonetheless, there were still some who harbored grandiose schemes. Alfonso de Albuquerque mused that the capture of Malacca meant that Cairo and Mecca would be ruined, and Venice would be able to obtain no spices except what merchants are able to buy in Portugal. He therefore set about slaughtering the Muslim populations of the city, which ultimately succeeded only in disrupting trade and generating hostility and profound mistrust. The ruling family retreated, establishing new sultanates in Perak and Johor that provided leadership in the face of continuous competition from European powers. However, in large and unlike in the Americas, the discovery of the route to the east generally became a story of cooperation rather than conquest. The result was a huge increase in trade from east to west, with Europe all but buckling under the weight of the riches being extracted from the Americas. The ability to pay for luxury goods from Asia rose dramatically. Soon the shops of Lisbon, Antwerp, and other emporia in Europe were bursting with Chinese porcelain and Ming silks. By far the most important imports, however, in terms of both quantity and desirability, were spices: pepper, nutmeg, cloves, frankincense, ginger, sandalwood, cardamom, and turmeric had been highly valued in food preparation in Europe since Roman times, prized both as ingredients that transformed the taste of bland foodstuffs and for their medicinal effect. Cinnamon, for example, was considered good for the heart, stomach, and head, and was thought helpful in curing epilepsy and palsy. Nutmeg oil was recognized as a treatment for diarrhea and vomiting, as well as in fighting the common cold. Cardamom oil soothed the intestines and helped reduce flatulence. In one Arabic manual written in the Mediterranean around this time, a chapter entitled Prescriptions for Increasing the Dimensions of Small Members and for Making Them Splendid, suggesting rubbing a mixture of honey and ginger onto the private parts, the effect would be so powerful and produce such pleasure that the man's sexual partner would object to him getting off her again. Competition to supply these newly minted markets was ferocious. Despite the alarm in Venice that followed news of Vasco da Gama's first expedition, the long-established trade routes were not replaced overnight. If anything, they had thrived thanks to rising demand in Europe. Then as now, consumers were not interested in how goods reached the marketplace. The only thing that mattered was price. Traders watched each other's jealousy, recording what was being bought and for how much. The Portuguese recruited merchants such as Matthew Becudo in the Levant to spy on the size of caravans and convoys coming from Egypt and Damascus, overland and by sea, and to report on the quantities of goods they were carrying. Rumors of bad crops of ships being lost with their cargoes, or of political unrest could affect prices on a day-to-day basis, making speculation a tricky business. There could be major fluctuations of supply depending on precisely when the spice fleet set sail, tilting the market heavily in favor of traders in the eastern Mediterranean who had access to better information and depended on less risky routes to market than rounding the continent of Africa.